Iraq, Darfur, Lebanon, Gaza, Democratic Republic of Congo, Burma, Nepal, Sri Lanka. These are just some of the more recent humanitarian tragedies and crises in war which come in and out of our consciousness, depending largely on the profile that they're given by the media. Media can draw attention to these crises, and sometimes they capture the public imagination. More often than not, we know that they are also quickly forgotten. Often what gets reported does not tell the full story, and more than often there is little follow-through beyond the headlines. Now, why does this matter to any of us? Well, of course, victims matter, but we also need to remember that most nations have legal obligations, nations like Australia, under the Geneva Conventions and under the ICC statute. Institutions have been created to hold those responsible for abuses accountable. But why does this often look like such a hit-and-miss operation? How can the media and humanitarian organisations responsibly draw the attention of policymakers to the need to investigate and to put a stop to or to prevent war crimes? How do they balance the requirement to increase public awareness with the risk that such attention might actually make it worse for the victims, make it less safe for the victims? And what role can the media and humanitarian organisations play in explaining the limits of current humanitarian law machinery in bringing those who have committed those crimes to justice? A very large topic, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome today Florian Westphal, the head of media at the International Committee of the Red Cross. As you know, the ICRC is one of the greatest and foremost humanitarian relief agencies involved in armed conflicts. And Florian, as a former broadcast journalist and producer, and now with the ICRC, is going to be very qualified to present both sides of the coins there and to draw some lessons for policymakers. Would you please join me in welcoming Florian Westphal?
Thanks very much for that introduction, Martine, and thanks very much for having me here and for having the International Committee of the Red Cross here. I think it's a real honor for us to be able to address you here today in these wonderful surroundings. And for me, it's a particular pleasure also to actually have more than 20 seconds to talk about what I care for, because my main job is being a spokesperson, and that does involve a lot of television sound bites. And a lot of what I'll be saying, obviously, may sound inherently very critical of television sound bites. At the same time, I remain convinced that 20 seconds do actually allow you to make some very major and important points. And they do allow you to really draw public attention and to also stimulate action on war crimes, even if they happen very far away. So let me say right from the start that I'm actually, despite all the shortcomings I'll be talking about concerning both media and humanitarian organizations, I'm actually fairly optimistic about what's going on. I came here also to do a conference together with the ABC on Monday on the challenges of reporting war, and having met quite a number of senior Australian foreign correspondents and producers and editors at that event, I think that's really confirmed my optimism that there is genuine commitment, not just for us, but also within the media to do as good a job as possible, and that people are convinced that this is important, well beyond the 20-second soundbite. As Martine's mentioned in the introduction, I think the question of war crimes and the question of international humanitarian law, so the body of international law that actually regulates conduct during warfare, has been really very much on the agenda, especially since the events of 9/11. You mentioned Guantanamo Bay. I think we can add the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which really, probably for the first time in quite a while for many countries in Europe, for example, have actually meant the first time that our armed forces have again become directly involved on the battlefields. And that's obviously also stimulated debate and media coverage and comment by humanitarians about their obligations and about what they're actually doing. There have been a lot of discussions in what's been called the context of the so-called war on terror on whether international humanitarian law is actually still relevant, whether it's quaint or outdated. You may remember those particular quotes. I won't go into that into too much detail, but I think what we've actually seen over the last few years is that there is a general consensus that these standards still count that they still matter. A couple of other examples of where they've focused really public attention from this year are clearly the conflict in Gaza, where we've had allegations on the one hand against the Israeli armed forces of war crimes. We've had allegations on the other hand against Hamas of having committed war crimes. Looking at Sri Lanka, which has obviously been on the news quite a bit, really pretty much the same scenario. Both sides mutually accusing each other of having committed some fairly horrendous acts. To be able to assess the significance of these allegations and to be able to also separate propaganda from fact, clearly a lot of us really rely in a major way on what the media can tell us about what's going on the ground, far away from where we are. And the media in turn really also are very much informed by what humanitarian organizations such as mine or also human rights organizations have to say about that, how they analyze what's going on the ground. Neither journalists nor aid workers actually have any kind of mandate clearly to prosecute suspected war criminals or to launch formal investigations, and we can't, decide on imposing sanctions on any conflict party or on sending peacekeepers anyway to resolve these issues. But clearly what we do have the potential of doing is to actually focus public awareness on them, public attention on them, through that mobilize public activism and in certain cases perhaps even have an influence on government policies, on our own governments and how they react to wars and war crimes happening elsewhere. I think it's easy to be quite critical or to be quite skeptical to what extent we've actually been very successful in terms of that, because the sad fact of the matter is that war crimes carry on. They are a daily occurrence, whether attention has been focused on them or not. But there have also been a number of successes. If we look back over the past couple of decades, I think we can look at something like the Ottawa Convention to ban anti-personnel landmines, where both humanitarian organizations, civil society, and the media played a key role in terms of generating that momentum. I think the same thing can be said for the establishment of the International Criminal Court, which clearly marks a major step forward in the fight to end the impunity for war crimes. We've seen actually something which I think would have been unthinkable a few decades ago. Former heads of government and heads of state, people like Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor, being held accountable for their actions, for the war crimes they're alleged to have committed in front of regularly constituted courts. And as critical as we have to be, I think we should acknowledge the progress this represents. And I think we should also acknowledge the fact that while media and aid workers were clearly not the ones who decided that these things were going to happen, they were a major driving force towards them. Maybe just a few words on terminology before I carry on. I will be referring a little bit to international humanitarian law, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Geneva Conventions, which are really at the core of this body of law. It does protect all those who do not or who no longer participate directly in hostilities. So civilians on the one hand, but also, for example, combatants who've surrendered, who are wounded, who are detained. It also imposes a set of restrictions on the permitted use of means and methods of warfare. So on the one hand, it outlaws certain tactics which are not allowed to be used, and it restricts the use or limits the use of certain types of weaponry. I've just mentioned some examples of that. The next thing I should, leading on from that, talk about a little bit is what do we mean when we talk about war crimes? Technically speaking, and I've double-checked with our lawyers on this, we are speaking about something called grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, for example. These are clearly things like willful killing, torture, inhumane treatment, depriving a protected person, for example a civilian, of the right to a fair trial. Those definitions provided by the conventions have been expanded and rendered in more detail, for example by the Rome Statute, which is the treaty on which the establishment of the International Criminal Court is based. Now, when I talk about media, things get pretty complicated, because at the end of the day, that encompasses such a diverse range of outlets and ways of doing things that it becomes incredibly difficult to generalize. I think based on my experience, clearly I will be talking more about the kind of Western media outlets which I'm mainly in contact with. But it's important to bear in mind that obviously what local media do in conflict areas themselves is absolutely significant and important in terms of investigating, but also especially preventing war crimes, in terms of raising awareness of the obligations that actually exist on conflict parties. It's also, and I'm not going to enter too much into detail on this, but I think it is important to bear in mind that we have had cases of journalists themselves joining the rank of the perpetrators. You may remember that the Arusha Tribunal, which deals with the genocide in Rwanda, sentenced 3 Rwandan journalists for their role in inciting the genocide in 1994. I mention that just to say that, to underline that the media are not necessarily always a force of good. The immense power they wield can also be put to the service of exactly those who are intent on committing the crimes in the first place. Finally, humanitarian organizations. Again, not that easy to generalize what are effectively tens of thousands of different organizations with very different ways of working and very different objectives. In the interest of simplicity, I'm also including human rights organizations, bodies like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, into this categorization, even though they wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as humanitarian organizations. The main thing I think to retain here is that not all of them work in the same way as far as war crimes are concerned. Clearly there are some which rely very much on public denunciation, on public condemnation, on bearing witness, and for them clearly the relationship with the media is key. The 2 I mentioned, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, are examples of that, but perhaps also MSF, which actually split off from the ICRC in the 1960s, exactly because it didn't agree with the ICRC's way of doing things concerning war crimes, which is to mainly act behind the scenes, to mainly act through direct dialogue with the conflict parties to try and put a stop to abuses. So again, difficult to generalize. For the ICRC, clearly, war crimes have a particular significance, not only because we work in zones of armed conflict, our job is to bring protection and assistance to victims of armed conflict, but also our mandate is actually based on international humanitarian law. It's largely defined by what it says in the Geneva Conventions. And what we are effectively trying to do, and this is what drew me to the ICRC in the first place, is to try to somehow translate what is in the text of the law into a reality on the ground, i.e., to help ensure that the victims of warfare really are protected in the way that is foreseen by international humanitarian law. It's an incredibly challenging task, and there's probably easily as much failure as success in this. One other thing we do is to try and have a preventive effect with our work. And for example, interesting to look at this region, and I have a number of colleagues here who covered this region from our office in Suva and here in Sydney. There the focus is obviously very much more on prevention. These are not countries at war, but at the same time we try and make sure that the key actors in particular, governments, armed forces, but also civil society, including journalists, know that there is a body of rules out there that matters and that they ought to be familiar with. Now, I've already talked a bit about the importance of raising public awareness in terms of making a difference when it comes to putting a stop to war crimes. And I picked out this quote by the famous American war photographer James Nachtwey about public awareness, because I think it really encapsulates extremely precisely what the intended effect of public awareness should be. What Nachtwey says, and I quote, is, "Through the experience of covering wars, I've come to realize that nothing in society exists in a vacuum, that solutions begin with shared awareness, that consciousness evolves into a sense of conscience, and that once our collective conscience becomes engaged, solutions, though they may take time and resources and a lot of hard work, become not only possible but inevitable." I think if you look at somebody like James Nachtwey, who's been covering the world's battlefields for several decades now, you see that for him these are not just empty phrases and empty words. This is a journalist who clearly sees his own role as going well beyond simply covering what he sees on the ground, but who feels that he can be a part of putting a stop to abuse, of improving the situation of those who are suffering most on the battlefields. But, you know, his definition of public awareness also, or of raising public awareness, also leads me on to thinking a little bit about what's sometimes been called the CNN effect. It seems nearly a bit outdated to speak about that now, but you may recall that, especially in the 1990s, that phrase was really seen to encapsulate this hope that if only we raised public consciousness effectively about what was happening in places like Somalia or Congo, that in itself could somehow miraculously transform itself into an impact on government policy and would force the hand, especially of the most powerful countries in the world, to really intervene and put a stop to war crimes. And I think there are examples clearly of the CNN effect at work. The one that's usually quoted most frequently is the US intervention in Somalia in the early 1990s, where there clearly was a feeling that media coverage, television pictures of starving children and of gun-toting warlords who prevented them from having any access to aid, that this clearly had an impact on the decision by the then President George Bush Sr. to send the Marines into Somalia, initially with the aim of actually protecting aid transport and aid delivery. But it's actually just as easy to find many, many examples of, well, where there is no CNN effect happening at all, or where even if there is a lot of public attention on war crimes, nothing much happens afterwards. And I think it's important to bear in mind that this CNN effect is somehow premised on the assumption that we are dealing with a relatively open and democratic system in which governments, those in power, are actually ready to accept the fact that what the media express, what the public wants, should be of any significance in terms of them making decisions. Clearly, you know, there are many countries at war where the political circumstances are not like that, and where the media, if anything, are very, very tightly controlled by the government, and are certainly not in a position to have any significant influence on what the government, or in fact any other conflict party, does. We had an interesting experience ourselves. As I mentioned before, for us, public denunciation of war crimes, of grave breaches of international humanitarian law, are extremely rare, because we do tend to rely more on behind closed door diplomacies and interventions, because we don't want to actually jeopardize our possibility to help exactly those people who are the victims of these abuses. But in 2007, in one of those rare exceptions, we actually decided that we were going to publicly talk about a number of very serious violations in Myanmar, which had been committed by the government of Myanmar. And specifically talking about abuses committed both against detainees and against civilians who were living in certain areas which had been particularly badly affected by fighting. And we made that decision as a very last step in a very long process, simply because we felt that A, we were just no longer, and hadn't been for a number of years, been allowed to actually do anything in the field or inside the prisons to help these people. And also because we'd come to see increasingly that there was really absolutely no interest on the part of the authorities to engage into any kind of meaningful and substantial dialogue on these abuses. There was, to us at that point, simply no readiness on their part to do anything about this. So the decision was made. I think we were being very, very clear in terms of our public declaration. I think many people realized that this was highly unusual for the ICRC. I mean, I would definitely maintain that that was the right thing to do, but at the same time, I think we also have to acknowledge that, well, we can certainly not be sure that it really made all that much difference to the people who we set out to help. At the moment, we still don't have access to the prisons. We didn't have access to then. We still don't have access to those regions we couldn't access then. So I'm not really in a position to tell you necessarily what the situation could be of these detainees and civilians who were our main concern there. But clearly we've got to be aware of the fact that maybe this public denunciation of these very serious violations generated a lot of media interest in the short term, also considerable political interest amongst certain states, but didn't make all that much of a difference for the people who were supposed to be at the core of the issue. I often have to remind journalists of this, that who obviously very automatically tend towards wanting to expose wrongdoings, that just by exposing wrongdoings, it doesn't necessarily mean that the solution, which Nachtwey talked about, comes about instantly and automatically. That's got a lot to do with the fact that in our societies, both public and media attention is actually quite fickle and short-lived. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into sort of media analysis or criticism here, but I think it does have to be said. The fact is that not just the media, but actually also us as the humanitarian sector tend to be much more interested in some conflicts than in others. There are actually some armed conflicts which have really completely dropped off the Western media agenda at all, and that's likely to get worse with the financial crisis having hit the media particularly hard, forcing them to make cuts, including and especially in their foreign news reporting. Couple of bits of evidence for this, if you want. In 2008, there were really only 3 foreign stories that made it into the list of the top 20 stories covered by the news programs of the 3 big US networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC. First, there was Iraq, but it's noteworthy that coverage of Iraq decreased from more than 4,100 minutes in 2003 to 244 minutes last year. The second foreign story were the Beijing Summer Olympics. And the third story was Afghanistan, which merited 126 minutes on the newscasts of the 3 main channels. That's 2 minutes more than the time they devoted to these stories about a Mormon sect which was practicing polygamy. You may remember. I mean, I'm being deliberately polemic here, but I think it does illustrate what we're looking at. There's a similar picture in the UK where figures about what's been called international factual programming, so these are basically longer program formats, documentaries, but not news bulletins, show that that kind of programming in terms of volume has actually remained fairly steady since the early 90s. There hasn't been a decrease. What has happened, though, is that more and more of it has been shifted to digital channels, which are actually only accessible to a small minority of viewers. And also, it's interesting to note that wars or armed conflict and the suffering they engender really aren't that much of a priority here. If you look at 2008 coverage of Africa, international factual programming in the UK, 40% was dedicated to wildlife, 4.5% was about conflict and disaster. Now, that's not going to be a very promising situation to start off with for any reporter or any aid worker who wants to shine the spotlight on, say, war crimes, for example, the massive epidemic of rape that has been a permanent feature of the conflict in the DRC. How do you manage to slip into those 4.5%? So at the ICRC, we really understand that the media interest will automatically go towards what's happening in Iraq or in Afghanistan. But we and many others, including many journalists, really regret that there are many, many other situations which simply haven't been able to attract any attention whatsoever. Think about Somalia, for example, where war has been a steady feature of the landscape really since the early 90s. Now, recently, obviously, Somalia has been on our TV screens quite a lot because we've had this sort of Somali version of the Long John Silver tale. And I really understand that Somali piracy is an incredibly important story and which has hugely significant for Europe, well, for Australia, I presume as well. Anyone who's using that major shipping channel obviously will be interested in this. But is it really that much more important than the fact that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have now for, nearly 2 decades been victims to not just a terrible situation, but also very intentional war crimes committed by all sides? We have to make sure that we get better somehow at focusing attention on this. And we, as humanitarian organizations, also have to accept our part of the responsibility for this. Because I'm not that sure that we're really doing the media all that many favors when it comes to presenting these very, very complex situations, when it comes to giving them the means to convince their editors back home that this story from Somalia is worth covering. I think we struggle in particular where these situations are extremely complex. I remember an example I experienced myself in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2000, where I was working, and I had this conversation with a CNN correspondent, basically asking her, why do you devote so little time to this conflict, which everybody called Africa's World War, which clearly affected millions of people, and at one stage 8 countries, which is, has considerable geopolitical repercussions. And basically her answer was quite revealing, because what she said was, look, well, you've got to understand that my editor is going to give me, 2 minutes for this story? So how do you want me, within 2 minutes, to explain a situation where you have something like a dozen different armed factions constantly shifting their alliances and fighting for a whole range of different economic and political and ethnic interests? She's got a point. Clearly, both journalists and perhaps also us as consumers of the media really prefer tales that are of war that are very simple, that involve good and evil, that allow us to make very quick decisions about who's responsible and who isn't. And that probably also explains that in the 90s, the initial coverage of things like the Rwanda genocide or like the war in the Balkans was so focused on describing these events as if they were kind of spontaneous outbursts of ethnic hatred, whereas actually what we were looking at was planned genocide and planned crimes against humanity. So we've got to make sure that as humanitarian organizations we help the media to really get to the bottom of the stories, help them to present them in a way that makes them accessible to a broader public, and without, though, oversimplifying the complexities of all this. I think as a final point, I just want to get on to really talk a little bit more about the CNN effect, or if you want, the interplay between public awareness, public opinion, and government action. And I don't think I'd be able, or I'd have the time to really do some in-depth analysis here, but I think it is quite interesting to actually look at what governments are obliged to do under international humanitarian law and what they can do. They have obligations. Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, to which every state in the world is a party, obliges states not just to respect these conventions, but to also ensure respect for them. Governments can allow their courts to prosecute war crimes that have been committed elsewhere. They can throw their support behind the International Criminal Court. Many of them have done so. They can take political measures, clearly, first of all by even publicly acknowledging that war crimes have occurred and are a problem. They can bring them to the table at the UN. They can at some stage or another decide to declare sanctions or support peacekeeping efforts or the like. But clearly all this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It first of all depends on whether a government judges it to be in the country's political or economic interest to get involved. And it also depends on how much weight a government actually carries within what we'd like to call the international community. Because my point here is that obviously that is very, very uneven in terms of the influence individual countries have, even if they want to do so, to move things sufficiently up on the international agenda that there is action. And even where this international community decides to take action, clearly there are limits to what it can do. I mean, I've been talking a lot about Somalia. I don't think there are any simple solutions now to immediately put an end to the fighting in Somalia. And I think the solutions that have been tried over the years, since the early 90s, be it through military intervention, peacekeeping, etc., have shown up just how problematic and difficult it is to put a stop to war crimes. A few more words, if I may, just about the importance of local media. I think what we've been trying to do really is to make sure that local media, alongside the combatants themselves, governments, political parties in conflict areas, really know what they're talking about when they're reporting on war crimes. I think our feeling has been that the first step to deal with this phenomenon of war crimes has got to be that of prevention. It's got to be making sure that the societies of countries that are at war or that are threatened by war really know that there are rules that apply and know the basics of these rules. And I think there's a big role that the media and local journalists play in terms of making sure that combatants, for example, are aware of this. Very often they are perhaps the main and only channel to reach, say, some rebel fighters who are active in faraway areas and who cannot be reached by any other means. So I think the role there and the training efforts which we've been engaged in, which other organizations have been engaged in, are extremely important. But at the same time, we've also got to understand, and I think we're realizing this very much, that there is an increasing sense of reluctance to accept what's very often seen as Western meddling in our affairs, and also very often seen as Western double standards. We notice this. Clearly, if we come towards a government and say, okay, we want to talk and raise certain credible allegations of violations of the law that have been committed, a lot of the time we get asked the question, okay, we can talk about that, but what exactly did you tell, for example, the Americans or the Israelis about their own behavior? Have you been applying the same kind of standards and the same rigor to them as you're applying to us? I.e., are you credible when you say that you really tackle this issue as a neutral observer, or do you actually have a partisan agenda? And I think the same very often actually also happens to Western media these days, that there's a lot less readiness to accept somehow that those of us coming in from the West have some sort of right to stick our noses into these issues. I think if you agree, and I'm looking forward to your questions, I'll stop here. I think it's, as I said in the beginning, there is a lot of reason to be quite optimistic, even though, again, if we look at what we've been seeing from Sri Lanka, what we've been seeing from Pakistan and from Gaza earlier, would probably make it a lot easier to be quite pessimistic. But I think if the media and aid organizations really work together to continue to raise public awareness, work together to make sure that what they are saying is not oversimplified, but clearly informed by a good basic understanding of the law, and doesn't deny the complexities of what's going on, doesn't fall into simplified tales of good and evil, then I think we will continue to have the chance to also have an influence on governments, on the international community, to take action. But at the same time, there's nothing automatic about that. Thank you very much.